quorum, and I declare this meeting in session. Welcome to this meeting of the Standing Senate Committee on National Security, Defence and Veterans Affairs. I'm Tony Dean, Senator representing Ontario and the chair of the committee, and I'm joined today by fellow committee members who will introduce themselves now, beginning with our Deputy Chair.
Guy Dagenet du Québec.
Peter Beam, Ontario.
Dave Richards on New Brunswick.
Stan Kuchar, Nova Scotia.
Welcome. Marty Deacon, Ontario.
Stan Yusuf, Ontario.
Andrew Cardoso, Ontario.
Donna Dasco, Senator from Ontario.
Victor, Ontario.
Senator Don Plett, Landmark, Manitoba.
Sénateur Pierre Boisvenu, Division La Salle, Québec.
Thank you, colleagues. And on my left is the committee's clerk, Ms. Ericka Dupont. For those watching the session, we're continuing our study of Bill C21, an act to amend certain acts and to make consequential amendments, all related to the question of the regulation of firearms in Canada. Today, we will hear from two panels of academics, researchers, and legal experts. In our first panel, we have the pleasure of welcoming Noah S. Schwartz, Assistant Professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Fraser Valley, and Mr. Tim Thurley, Firearms Researcher and Policy Specialist. Thank you both for joining us today. We invite you to provide your opening remarks, to be followed by questions from our members, and I remind you that you each have 5 minutes for your testimony. We begin today with Mr. Noah Schwartz. Mr. Schwartz, you may begin whenever you're ready. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. I've come here today all the way from Abbotsford, British Columbia, the traditional territory of the Stalo people, to talk about Bill C21. I'll be frank and honest, I do not think that Bill C21 in its present form will achieve its goal of improving public safety. Worse still, my research documents the harm that this bill will cause to communities across Canada. I'd like to focus my comments on two important areas of the bill. First, the prohibition on what the government has labeled assault-style firearms. The evidence from the scholarly literature, which I encourage you to review in the brief that my colleagues and I have submitted to this committee, speaks fairly clearly. There's very little support in the literature for a ban on assault-style weapons. Bans in other jurisdictions have failed to achieve their intended goals of reducing mass shootings and homicides. The simple fact is these firearms are rarely used in crimes and easily substituted for other weapons. Second, the freeze on handgun ownership is also unlikely to have an impact on gun crime in Canada. Handguns have been tightly regulated here since the 1930s. A variety of data sources, from police data to academic studies to government reports, have shown consistently that the vast majority of handguns showing up at crime scenes in this country are being smuggled illegally from the United States. For example, data recently released by the Toronto Police shows that only 3% of crime guns in Ontario were legally owned in Canada before showing up at a crime scene, only 3%. There are clear economic incentives for gun smugglers. Handguns can be purchased easily in the United States and sold for a large markup on the Canadian black market. Combined with the very concerning rise of 3D printed firearms, criminals in Canada and gangs will continue to have easy access to illegal firearms. I believe the freeze is also overly broad. Even if the assumption were accurate that freezing some handguns might reduce crime, which I don't believe it is, the freeze targets firearms that could not conceivably pose a major risk to public safety, such as low-powered .22 caliber handguns used by Olympic athletes. The freeze would also make Canada an outlier amongst our allies. Of 38 OECD countries, 33 allow licensed and vetted citizens to own handguns. My research also speaks to the harm that Bill C21 will cause. Over the course of my research, I've surveyed over 16,000 Canadian gun owners from coast to coast and done longer interviews with almost 100 others. The people I've spoken to are not extremists. Most actually express their support for the strict gun control laws that Canada already has in place. When asked what values they associate with gun ownership, responsibility and community were the two most common. They do, however, feel cheated by legislation like Bill C21 and expressed a serious loss of faith in the institutions of government as a result of recent policy decisions. And I want to share a few of the stories that they were brave enough to share with me, with you today. Jim is a young man living in rural Ontario, and after a car accident, he became a C6 quadriplegic. His love of shooting is one of the only hobbies, of target shooting is one of the only hobbies he's been able to carry over from his pre-injured life. His rifles may not look like Grandpa's hunting rifle, but it's exactly the ergonomic features of these firearms that make them accessible, even possible, for him to use. Ava is a cowboy action shooter in her 60s who spends most of her time volunteering at our local range to organize competitions. Western enthusiasts like Ava dress up in cowboy clothes and compete in shooting competitions with low-powered, single-action, 6-shot revolvers. The effects of Bill C21 will result in the slow death of the community that she has worked so hard to build. After all, any community that cannot welcome new members is living on borrowed time. Finally, Caillin is a young Chinese-Canadian man in his early 20s living in BC. He's a reenactor, and his deep love of preserving the past connects him to a community of living history enthusiasts. He mostly shoots single-shot, black powder, muzzle-loading firearms, including some handguns that are now frozen. As your study of Bill C21 progresses, you'll undoubtedly hear from many people like this. And I want to emphasize that the choices made in this room are not without consequence to real people who have shared their stories with me. Creating good policy is about balancing the possible benefits of a policy with the potential harms. In the case of Bill C21, my research suggests that the benefits are highly uncertain and the harms very real. Thank you very much for your time, and I really look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schwartz. We'll now hear from Mr. Thurley. Whenever you're ready, Mr. Thurley, please proceed.
Good morning, Senators, and thank you for the honor to testify here today. I am proud to live and work in Yellowknife on the traditional territory of the Dene people. I've come straight from there, so please excuse my jet lag. My 2017 MSc thesis attempted to make sense of firearm policy by examining the relationship between homicide trends and the long gun registry. My firearm publications on topics from classification criteria to Bill C21 have appeared in The Line, The Post, and at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute with my colleague Noah. When the long gun registry was introduced, many warned of huge expenditure with few prospects for gains. Similar patterns are emerging now. I believe the legislation before us will be regressive, harmful, and profoundly unjust. It will introduce great costs without realizing the anticipated benefits we all desire. The societal costs are substantial, and I want to give additional voice to their impact on rural, northern, and Indigenous lives. The Assistant Deputy Minister acknowledged on Monday that Indigenous Canadians will suffer the most from the punitive and mandatory permanent license revocations that remove discretion and undermine the principles of rehabilitation. Those who take a plea instead of fighting their case will lose their guns permanently. No questions, no appeal, and no consideration. The ill-considered red flag proposals are also problematic. Under Canada's existing licensing system, police and judges already have the power to remove guns and revoke licenses from those who pose a threat. But the new provisions have no requirements to consider Indigenous hunting rights, for the complainant to have any relationship to the accused, or for the accused to be heard in court. Indigenous people are disproportionately impacted by the criminal justice system and are also the most reliant on firearms for subsistence. We will undermine the built-in safeguards of the existing red flag law. Where people hunt to feed families, this has real consequences. Considering feeding families, sport shooters contributed $2.6 billion to the Canadian economy in 2018. The slow, uncompensated phase-out of handguns will eventually remove 650,000 restricted license holders from sport shooting. The government has freely admitted this is the purpose. The closure of family businesses and ranges will result. Where does this leave hunters and exempted individuals such as trappers and Olympians? Despite these regressive outcomes, some maintain the benefits brought by bans will be worth it. They won't. Research is clear. If we care about saving lives, the smart place to spend our time and energy is on almost literally anything else. Canada's low, but tragic, homicide rate is not driven by legally owned handguns. The proportion of seized and traced handguns cited by Canadian police regularly approaches 90% foreign origin. Further corroboration is that we have not seen corresponding increases in crime committed with legal handguns, despite recent increases in legal ownership and a record number of PAL holders. Data is sparse. We need to make some assumptions, and this is imperfect. but I want to give you an illustration of scale, just as an overview. Of 874 total homicides in 2022, this is all Statistics Canada data, 216 involved handguns. If 90% of those were smuggled from abroad, as police services regularly claim, that would imply around 22 homicides with domestic source handguns. That's 2.5% of all homicides and 10% of all handgun homicides before we account for method or source substitution, as we have in our briefs. The legislation cannot touch, cannot reduce the remaining 97.5% of all, nor the remaining 90% of handgun homicides. Let's go back to that 22 figure. 12 times that number die needlessly due to nutritional deficiencies every year in Canada. 21 times that number sadly drown. 6 times as many people are unspeakably beaten to death. It's outstripped by homicides caused by unknown methods. Homicide is a substantial problem in Canada, but it's rarely the legal owners of legal handguns doing it. Now, risk is never a flat zero. I'll acknowledge that. We can mitigate it, but we cannot eliminate it. While every single premature death is tragic, public policy is about making choices with finite resources, and smart homicide reduction policy would not focus on squeezing out just a few more decimals from rigorously screened licensed owners when we can talk about the larger part of the problem. It's an exercise in diminishing returns, especially when illegal firearms are so prolific and most homicides in this country are not committed with firearms. I won't speculate today why the government chose a narrow focus, that's not my place, but Canada could spend funds and energy on far better outcomes by addressing the determinants of crime. There are more impactful and less harmful paths to take if homicide reduction is the goal. We've detailed many alternatives in our submitted briefs and open letters. The government has nevertheless chosen to plow on with a freeze they didn't even have in their platform. This policy-making style is dangerous. Honourable senators will remember it from C11 and C18. Poorly considered legislation was put forward, consequences were identified, senators made changes to mitigate them. The government rejected key changes. We're now beginning to see the predicted consequences come to life. I encourage senators to treat Bill C21 in the same way. Even its most well-intentioned provisions will hurt law-abiding citizens. It has damaged trust and undermined confidence in our existing gun control compromise. It deserves to be scrutinized, examined, and heavily amended, or rejected outright. As the Chamber of Sober Second Thought, I firmly believe it is not just the Senate's right, but its duty. Thank you for your time. I'll be pleased to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thurley. We'll now proceed to questions, colleagues. Before proceeding, just the regular warning about being careful to lean in too close to the microphone or to remove your earpiece when doing this. This will avoid harm from feedback that could otherwise materialise. Our guests are with us till 12:30 today. I'm looking at the clock. We'll do our best to allow time for each member to ask a question, but with this in mind for this session, 3 minutes initially will be allotted for each question, including the answer, so we really need to keep those questions succinct and to identify the witnesses that you are addressing. I'll now offer the first question to our Deputy Chair, and today I'm going to be flagging a 30-second warning with this appropriate titled card, Best Practices for Committee Meetings. So away we go. Our first question goes to the Deputy Chair, Senator Desjardins.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. I want to thank our witnesses. My first question goes to Mr. Thurley. Mr. Thurley, in a text that you signed in the National Post in March, you estimate, unless I'm mistaken, that the public opinion of Canadians is manipulated by anti-firearms lobbyists and that it's forced to think that new legislation on firearms control will save lives. So, in your opinion, why is the current Liberal government and those of the past go ahead with this legislation without concretely taking measures to fight against the types of weapons that are usually used by criminals, and something that you mentioned? And in these firearms control measures, why will the government deprive itself of taxes that should enough suffice to finance the RCMP and the CBSA?
Thank you. I think there were some potential there were some pauses in interpretation, so I want to be sure I got it all. I don't have inside knowledge into the government's perspective on this more than any senators do. My belief ultimately is that a lot of this legislation wasn't terribly well considered. There are aspects of this legislation which I think are undoubtedly political in nature. In terms of why the government would remove tax revenue, I genuinely don't know, but I think that will come back to the ill-considered aspect. Certainly, sport shooters do contribute a substantial amount to not just tax revenue, but I think my colleague Dr. Schwartz will elaborate on this, to enforcement of firearm regulation, which itself helps groups like the RCMP and the CBSA. So, at the risk of going on too long, when, as law enforcement officers know, enforcement really requires two components, and these are trust and voluntary compliance. And ensuring voluntary compliance requires maintaining trust. So I'm getting a time signal, but I'll come back to that later.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Thurley. I'm afraid there isn't. We'll come back to you if we possibly can.
Monsieur le Président.
We now have Senators Oplet, Deakin, Ontario, Couch-Boisvenu, and Gerber in the lineup. Senator O, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, witnesses, for traveling a long journey here. And my question for you is, as you may know, earlier this week that we had the minister and the officers before the committee. And one argument that was made by officers was this. Matthew Taylor, General Counsel and Director, Criminal Law Policy Section, Department of Justice, Canada, and said that gang-related homicide involving firearms increased by 27% in 2021. Also, as you look at the number of firearms that we have traced through various tracing efforts, 69% of those firearms were deemed to have been illegally imported into or manufactured here in Canada. Legal firearms that are in Canada are likely contributing to the pool of firearms that are being used in the gang-related and organized crime homicide. That is the government's argument that I cannot see how their statistics make that case. The witness is saying 69% of crime guns are either illegally imported or are manufactured in Canada. Perhaps the witnesses meant to say illegal imported, but either way, I'm not sure that what this statistic tell us. And am I understanding that this correctly, or what are your thoughts of this statistic, and what is their interpretation of them? Either one, both of you, please.
Sure.
I'm afraid I have to interrupt. We'll come back to you. Senators, it is with extraordinary sadness that we have learned this morning of the passing of our colleague, Senator Ian Shuggart. This has been communicated by our Speaker. On behalf of the Senate of Canada, we extend sincere condolences to the Shuggart family. And honourable senators and witnesses, please join me now in observing a minute of silence in honour of our lost colleague. Thank you, colleagues. It's a very sad moment for all of us, so I appreciate it, and I thank you for participating in this today. I think Mr. Thurley was about to answer. Please proceed.
Thank you for the question. I'm very sorry for the loss to his family and to all senators who knew him. Regarding the statistics presented by the RCMP, I was watching that committee meeting. There were a few pieces that I noticed. One was that of about, I believe it was 5,000 firearms, they were using that 69% figure as the percentage of the 1,800 or so, which they actually traced. Firearms are generally easier to trace, from my understanding, when they have a domestic origin, so that would naturally bias the numbers in that direction. And additionally, my understanding is also that they didn't separate out long guns and handguns there. We're mostly talking about, since we're talking about largely a handgun freeze, that's an important distinction to make. And my colleague Dr. Schwartz has a large collection of sources on this subject as well.
Yeah, I mean, if I can jump in. So handguns by their very nature are easier to smuggle across the border. They're much more easier to conceal in a car, on your person. And we have lots of data from police sources in large cities like Toronto, like Vancouver, where a lot of the surge in gang crime is happening. And the data from these cities show overwhelmingly that these guns are coming from the United States. I have a few examples. For example, the data from Ontario, or in Montreal, 95% of handguns used in Montreal were illegal. 79% of traced handguns in Ontario were foreign sourced, largely coming from the United States. Ontario is the only province with a comprehensive tracing program. The rest of Canada traces only about 6 to 10% of firearms, and the Ontario numbers fairly consistently show a large majority of guns being smuggled from the United States, which makes sense when you consider the fact that we share the world's largest unmilitarized border with a country that has more guns than people.
Thank you both.
Okay, you mentioned earlier.
Senator O, I'm afraid we've run out of time. We'll come back to you if we can. We now go to Senator Plett.
Thank you, Chair. I want to echo your comments with the sadness of passing of our very dear friend. My question is for either or both of the witnesses, and I'll read both of my questions for the sake of time here. In a letter sent by witnesses to senators, it has been argued that the red flag and non-discretionary license revocation provisions in the legislation will in fact not increase public safety and are vulnerable to abuses, especially against Indigenous and other marginalized populations. Could you elaborate on as to how Indigenous and marginalized populations might be impacted by these provisions? And then further, please, it has been suggested that these provisions should be struck from the bill. If the majority in this committee do not support striking that from the bill, do you see any other viable amendment, very briefly, that might make these provisions more reasonable? So Dr. Schwartz and then Mr. Thurley, please.
Yeah, so my understanding of a variety of organizations have also commented on this, saying that Canada's existing laws surrounding removing firearms from the hands of a licensed owner who poses a danger, a threat to themselves or others, are already robust. This new change would allow for ex parte revocations, which means that an accusation could be made by someone who doesn't even know the person that they're accusing. They may have never met them in real life, and there would be no way for the accused to know who's making that accusation. We know that Indigenous people in Canada, we know that other marginalized groups are disproportionately targeted by the legal system and have a tougher time navigating the legal system, and that is why we believe that these could pose a threat to marginalized groups like Indigenous Canadians.
Mr. Thurley, is there another amendment that could possibly be put in?
I would strike that entirely. I don't believe it's necessary. The CFO already has the power to revoke licenses and remove firearms. This can actually be done without going through the judicial process. It also doesn't need to be through local police. It can be through a simple call to the Canadian Firearms Program. They have a hotline which, if anyone has called the 1-800 number, can essentially be immediately accessed. I think this is a really, really problematic series of amendments. The Mohawk Council have detailed this in their brief as well. Just to give a context, though, in the Northwest Territory, 60% of people have eaten country food, meaning hunted or fished, in the past 7 days. So if somebody, even if they end up getting their guns back after one of these ex parte applications is made, they might not have food for the year. This is a very, very, very serious thing in small and rural communities.
Thank you. We now go to Senator Deakin, Ontario.
Thank you. Thank you for being here today. And your empathy, our colleague would want us to continue doing this work, so we will carry on, and thank you for your responses thus far. And our time is tight. I'm going to come back to something around that we've heard a little bit about around the ghost guns, and particularly those that can be downloaded and printed. While there's no doubt there may be some difficulty in enforcing the law in this regard, I never found that to be a particularly compelling argument. Laws also discourage people from doing something. It makes sense to me that we would make owning and distributing the data that can be used to create an untraceable and in some cases undetectable firearm illegal. I can't envision any legitimate reason why someone would have that. You mentioned in your letter that while you don't necessarily disagree with this provision, you do have reservations, and I'm hoping that either one of you are able to expand on that today.
I personally think that that is important that we increase the face the serious threat that's posed by 3D printed ghost guns. I actually don't have a serious problem with that section of the legislation. I think it is sensible because we are seeing a rise, police reporting year after year, a higher proportion. This was sort of a non-issue in 2019, and now we're seeing hundreds, police officers reporting hundreds across the country. So I think that is, stepping in to do something about that, I think is prudent.
Thank you.
And I'm sorry, can I clarify, was the main component of the question regarding the possession of the actual data files? Okay. I could potentially think of some scenarios in which a firearms manufacturer might want to possess a data file, but by and large, I think the way it's phrased right now from memory is probably okay on that front. My issues were more when it came to possession of a firearm that was potentially manufactured unlawfully, because it can be quite difficult to prove, especially with older guns, what exactly the provenance of it was. Some very old firearms won't necessarily have serial numbers, for example, or a manufacturer name or a make or a model. If you go through old long gun registry data, it's actually, there are quite a lot of entries with, I have a redacted 2012 copy, I believe. There are a lot of entries that are just marked unknown for make and model. So that would be my potential concern, but I don't have a large concern with that overall. I think it's mostly in enforcement where my concern might come in.
Time? Yep. Thank you.
We now go to Senator Kuchar. Thanks very much. Over to you.
Thank you very much, both, for coming such a long distance. Very appreciated. The question is for Mr. Thurley, but Mr. Schwartz, if there's time, you can jump in because you've also written on this topic. In the National Post, Mr. Thurley, you addressed a very important issue of economic impact, and that others have raised it. And the question, if you don't have on hand, if you could send us the information. In that op-ed, you provided an overview of the cost, about $6 billion, but your reported cost estimates were based on, and I quote, a total ban on civilian gun ownership, end of quote. So that wasn't Bill C21. I'm just taking it out of the article. But it's a very, very important point. So I wonder if you could help us understand two things on the economics of this. The first thing, could you give us a comprehensive economic analysis of the projected negative economic impact of C21? Who, how much, over what period of time? So the negative side of the ledger. And then could you also, as part of that economic analysis, help us understand the other side of the ledger? The cost of homicide and suicide, the life survival analysis from the life survival tables, and the healthcare cost estimate. So that would help us get a better understanding of this very important economic argument.
Yeah. So there are a few components to that question. The first was that I didn't, from my recollection, I didn't predicate my stats from the article in the National Post on a total ban. That was more regarding the what the groups, the groups I was citing had said, but I was quoting two figures. First, the estimates for the buyback, and then second, the economic benefits brought by hunting and sport shooting from the Conference Board of Canada study in 2018. In terms of data sort of offsetting the net cost, so when we're talking about the positives and negatives of the balance sheet, that would be an extremely complex undertaking. It's something which I am seeking to work on, and I hope I will be able to in the future, but I have not had the resources to do that work for myself at the moment. I believe Dr. Schwartz might have some additions there as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a political scientist, not an economist, but I know, speaking from the literature, for example, we know with firearms and suicide, for example, which you spoke about, that method substitution is often a serious problem. So there's no guarantee that removing a gun from that situation will mean, unfortunately, that individual won't find it.
On the economic modeling, so that answer, I appreciate the answer, but that's not what the question was about.
Right. Okay. Yeah. No, sorry. I
so
don't have
neither of you have that data.
Sorry, I do think that the that question is rather
of time. We now go to Senator Boisvenu, followed by Senators Gerber, Dasco, and Youssef. Senator Boisvenu.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd also like to extend to the family of our colleague sincere condolences. The government has always claimed that Bill C21 is a response to the organized crime problem, particularly street gangs. The minister said that someone said it's not necessarily the case. Between 1979 and 2014, 15 years after adoption of the famous firearms regime, homicides using firearms were reduced by 30%. Between 1995 and 2010, whereas we had a very rigorous register, regulation was only 25%. So after spending $2 billion, we've realized that this regime has had no impact on homicides. In your brief, you stated that one of the impacts of this bill will be the massive reduction of weapons that are used by our police officers for their practice because they have to comply with their requirements for their grade once a year, otherwise they can't carry weapons. Could you explain to us how this bill will have a negative impact on the training of our police officers when it comes to shooting? Thank you. It's a very good question. From what I understand, talking with sports shooters and people who have shooting ranges, most of their money comes from shooters who have handguns because they have to belong to a shooting range. And it provides a lot of money to shooting range owners so that they can survive. When it's difficult and more stringent,
range, right? There's strict zoning restrictions. As cities increase, they are sort of being pushed out and they're having a tough time surviving. So they really rely on those memberships from restricted handgun owners. And as we know, for example, the Stittsville range in Ottawa is where the Ottawa police do their handgun training. Where I'm from in Abbotsford, the Abbotsford Fish and Game Club is where Abbey PD goes to do their handgun training. And so if these ranges are impacted severely financially, it could have an impact on space that police use for training.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We now go to Senator Gerber.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We are all very saddened by the death of our colleague, Honorable Ian Sugat. I'll ask my question in French. I think we all agree here on the importance of fighting against violence, intimate partner violence, particularly in cases where firearms are used. You and a group of academics tabled a brief in which you criticized some sections of this legislation, particularly emergency prohibition orders, the red flag provisions. Could you explain to us how this inclusion in the criminal code could be prejudicial and how the current provisions of Section 117 of the Criminal Code handles this very severe problem?
That's an excellent question, Senator. Thank you very much. So in my view, first of all, I think it's important to note that these orders are effectively redundant. So right now, police have the authority to confiscate firearms from an individual who could pose a threat. They can do this. They don't need a warrant. They can do it without a warrant. All an individual needs to do is call the hotline, their local police service, explain their concern. The police can then investigate and come to their own conclusion. I think the new system is more difficult to use. I think this has been generally acknowledged by the government as they keep discussing why they want NGOs, how they want NGOs to be involved to help people navigate these. I note the Canadian Bar Association has called the existing laws, quote, sufficient and preferable to the proposed changes. I think because the complaints are anonymous, the court records are sealed, this system could be pretty vulnerable to false, trivial, or vexatious complaints made against high-profile individuals, even police officers and members of the military. And I think Indigenous Canadians who are already disproportionately involved in the justice system will have an especially difficult time navigating this process and attempting to get firearms back if they are unjustly taken. That's not to say that most complaints are vexatious. However, I am saying that there is a mechanism already to deal with the investigation process and remove firearms from dangerous individuals, and I think the new additions will be problematic.
Thank you. Bang on time. We now go to Senator Daska.
Well, thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. I have a couple of questions. Mr. Thurley, you threw in a critique of Bills C11 and C18, so I'm wondering if perhaps you actually object to government involvement, government regulation in the lives of Canadians. Would that be your main motivation for throwing that into the discussion? And so is that where your main objection is, that you don't think that government should take action, tough action in many areas of social, economic life?
No, on the contrary, I think there is a role for government. The question, I think, and my critique was more focused on perhaps both the scope and the consideration that was given, and then the government's response to the consideration that was given. So in terms of the principle, sometimes it's appropriate for the state to regulate, sometimes it isn't. I'm no anarchist, that's for sure. But in this case, I think what we're trying to show is not that this is an unregulated area, but rather that this is an appropriately regulated area. And while there are some changes perhaps that could be made to the Firearms Act, in general, I think we're trying to get the balance right in this country, and I think this perhaps oversteps that mark a little bit.
We have more time?
Yes.
Sure. Yes. Yeah. I want to keep pursuing the topic of domestic violence, and you have both of you have placed your objections to the provisions here, especially with respect to Indigenous communities. But what about Indigenous women? They are to be considered as well. And I haven't heard any concern on your part about the situation of Indigenous women and how their concerns might be met in this provision.
No, I think that's a really important question. So we've seen the Canadian Bar Association as well as women groups have also raised their concerns about these red flag laws. So it's not just sort of our concern. It's been coming from groups, including women's groups, who have spoken out against these red flag provisions. So I think it's certainly important, but there's a lot of tools in place to tackle an issue as complex as intimate partner violence. And this is, I don't think, the best tool to tackle this.
Some want these provisions to be tougher, in fact, not to remove them.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. We now go to Senator Youssef, and Senator Richards follows him on round 2. We have Senators Dagenet and O. Please signal if you'd like to follow them. Senator Youssef.
Thank you, Chair. And of course, bit of a sad day for you to come here today, but thank you very much for making the time and being here. Just very quickly, following up on two of my colleagues' question on red flag laws. The opinion you offer is not on evidence, because there's no evidence yet in regard to the impact about prejudice in the judicial system against First Nation. This is just your thoughts that this could happen. We don't have any evidence to that. There's a court system that's fairly robust in this country that has the capacity to discern prejudice and of course, rancor among individuals. So in terms of what you're offering, you don't offer any evidence in regard to how this law, red flag laws, might work, because we don't know that. Is it fair for me to say that?
Yes, yeah, it's hard. It's impossible to offer evidence about a law that hasn't passed yet.
Good. So, we could all speculate. The reality is domestic violence is a real thing, and if one life is saved, it's one life that we don't have to worry. That might be. But I do agree with you. There is ample evidence on the books that the laws that are there right now could, if it's effectively enforced by the police, it could provide security for women in this country to a large extent. On the question of the issue of firearms, because there's a lot of confusion and disinformation in the public. This bill does not confiscate or take away the guns of anybody that currently own a gun legally in the country. Am I right in my assumption on that, my understanding?
As far as I understand it, yes.
Right. So, because there's been a lot of, false information about we're going to take away people's gun. And in the context of survival of ranges where people go to practice their craft and do that, we don't have any evidence yet on record to suggest that they will demise overnight. I recognize they may not grow because the membership may not expand, but we don't have any evidence to that reality.
I mean, I have some issues with that approach, because it's a bit difficult, I think, to provide. By the time that particular evidence exists, it's too late. It's over. It's done. There's no coming back at that point. So I think the government, I think we can go with the data we have, and handgun owners especially disproportionately contribute in terms of fees, in terms of purchases, to the maintenance, the operation of ranges, to the firearm industry in Canada. They tend to purchase more. And in doing so also almost subsidizes the ranges for everybody else. So as the government has made its intent quite clear, it says that it's aiming to eliminate all of this within 50 years. That was the quote from Monday. So by the time that's all gone, it's too late.
Thank you very much. We now finish this round with Senator Richards.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I too give my condolences to the family and friends of the late Senator Shugart. I only spoke to him once or twice. I found him a remarkable man. I thank the witnesses for being here, and I don't think this is just prejudicial toward the First Nations. I had moose meat in the last 7 days. I've been hunting since I was 14. And it's a hard bill when we're dealing with firearms and domestic violence and everything. But on second reading, I spoke against the oppressive nature of the red flag law, the idea of a company of unknown snitchers. And this had been talked about, I know, by Senator Zerba and others. But could you comment on how this is a dangerous and redundant policy fashioned by politicians who might not have had any experiences with hunters or rifles, and why this level of authority is now unneeded? Because we have things in place that do contribute to the the confiscating of dangerous weapons by people who may be dangerous. Could either of you or both of you might comment on that for a second?
I absolutely could. My first criticism, of course, is the redundancy of these provisions. Another criticism would be access to courts, especially in rural and northern areas, but since that was discussed on the Monday meeting, I'll skip over that. The lack of safeguards and the lack of investigatory capability, I think, of the court in an ex parte hearing is the largest problem here. So, in addition to the mandatory revocation, but that's another aside. When it comes to the individual not being able to offer a defense and the court not having that immediate investigatory tool, which the police do have, it makes it very difficult to dismiss vexatious complaints. So what can happen is that an individual targets somebody, and we do know that Indigenous people, unfortunately, are disproportionately impacted by the justice system. Between 2019 and 2020, 10% of all Indigenous men between, I believe it's 24 and 35, were in prison at some point. So we know that there is a disproportionate impact here. And I think it's absolutely critical to be aware that individuals cannot offer a defense, may lose important tools that are critical to their immediate livelihoods, and given the nature of the system, might not be able to have tools to appeal those mechanisms.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, we now go to round two. We have four senators, and I think that would just about finish up our time. We have Senators Dagenet, O, Gerber, and Platt. Senator Dagenet, over to you.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My next question goes to Mr. Schwartz. Mr. Schwartz, when I hear very little positive comments about such a bill, I'm concerned. Could you tell us what guides politicians in coming up with such a bill as C21? Are they victims of lobbyists, at least when it comes to some aspects of the bill, or are they simply looking for electoral votes? It's difficult to answer. I cannot put words in the mouths of politicians. But as a political scientist, I look at incentives. I find out what parties can win by doing something like this.
Incentives to passing legislation that is sweeping and that is strong, or that appears to be strong on face value. And I think that there's a lot of good sound bites that can come from this policy, and at first glance it can appear like we are doing something to save lives and that we're doing something to make the lives of Canadians better. But really, upon closer inspection and closer observation, I don't think this is going to help reduce crime. I don't think it's going to help save lives in Canada. And I think that we should be spending our money on community-based programs that are going to improve the lives of marginalized people, so that young people in Canada, especially young people from marginalized communities, aren't looking to turn to life in a gang as a way to solve their problems. They don't see that as a way of getting respect or a way of earning a living at a time where rent is increasing and food is more expensive than ever.
Thank you. Colleagues, I was misreading the clock. We're rapidly running out of time. We have three senators wishing to ask questions. We've got 1 minute each for a very quick question and a quick answer. So, Senator O, you're next, followed by Senator Gerber.
Thank you, Chair. For Mr. Schwartz, a simple question. You interview 16,000 gun owners across the country. What is the response? What's the reaction? What is the impact and harms to them?
Yes, I think a lot of the people that I spoke to and that I surveyed are very, very dedicated to their passion. The amount of money that they spent, the average person in my survey had spent several $1,000s that year on accessories or firearms or ammunition or hunting trips, things like this. These people are very dedicated to their sport and to their hobby. And some, as we know, in northern regions or Indigenous people are relying on this to put food on the table. So I think calling that into question and potentially harming those communities on fairly shaky grounds with regards to public safety benefit, I don't think is worth it.
Thank you.
Oui, juste la suite de mon collègue.
To follow up on what my colleague just said, how can we improve and better adapt Bill C21 for it to meet the needs of the Northern Territories?
Thank you, Senator. I really appreciate that question. I think that means a lot to people in the territories. Our brief with recommended amendments to C21 does engage in Indigenous-specific issues. So there are quite a few changes that have been detailed there. I believe our document is about 14 pages long and available on the Senate site. And the Mohawk Council brief is one that I would actually very strongly recommend reading as well. I think they did an excellent job of relating how this could apply to hunting rights, freezing rights in time, and UNDRIP. So I would strongly recommend reading that brief as well. I'm sorry that I don't have time to give a more full answer and can only refer you to other documents.
Thank you. Senator Plett.
I will be very brief, and it can be a very brief answer. Witnesses have argued that one of the implications of this bill is the elimination of an entire sports community in Canada. And it has been said that in this regard, Olympic athletes will be no exception. Can you explain what the impact is likely to be? For example, is it viable for the government to say that we are banning the sale and purchase of all pistols in Canada, but somehow assert that we can credibly exempt only Olympic shooting?
No, I think that this is going to have an impact, and I believe we've heard from Olympians saying that this is going to have an impact on them, both in terms of recruiting new people into the sport to sustain the program, in terms of having competitors to practice against before the Olympics, in terms of sourcing their equipment. This will have a significant impact, from what I've heard, on Olympic athletes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Plett. Mr. Schwartz and Mr. Thurley, we thank you sincerely for the evidence and advice you've brought to us today. It has been very helpful. You've seen the interest around the room in the work that you do and the writing that you've done and research. And we especially thank you for making the effort to travel large distances to do this with us today. It's great to see you in person. So we're grateful for that, and we wish you both safe travels home. And with that, colleagues, we will suspend briefly to bring in the next panel. We'll now continue with our next panel. For those tuning into today's meeting, we're exploring Bill C21, an act to amend certain acts and to make certain consequential amendments, all related to the regulation of firearms in Canada. For this next hour, we have the pleasure of welcoming both by video conference Mr. Christian Leuprecht, Professor at the Department of Political Science and Economics at the Royal Military College of Canada, and Dr. Caillin Langmann, Assistant Program Director and Competence Committee Chair at the Department of Medicine at McMaster University. Thank you both for joining us today. We now invite you to provide your opening remarks, to be followed by questions from our members. I remind you that you each have 5 minutes for your testimony, and we will begin with Mr. Leuprecht. Whenever you're ready, please proceed.
Monsieur le Président, je vous remercie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for this invitation.
Which is situated on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, and Haudenosaunee peoples. I direct a large empirical research program on global illicit flows. I've published on firearms policy. I'm a member of the Kingston Police Services Board, although I do not speak for the board, but I do not have a firearms license or certificate. The proposed legislation amounts to a creeping total ban on handguns. In effect, it replicates Section 12601 of the Firearms Act. Introduced by a previous Liberal government, this section prohibited previously restricted firearms with a barrel length of 105 millimeters or less that shoot calibers of certain types of calibers of ammunition. In April 2005, that amendment imposed a prohibition on firearms that had previously only been restricted. So we have a track record of its impact over the past 18 and a half years. Firearms that fall under 12.6 can no longer be sold. They cannot even be passed down as an inheritance. This has had the following effect. It depressed the value of collector firearms because there's no longer a market for these firearms. And it has amounted to imposing a slow-moving outright bans on firearms under 12.6. The draft legislation before you applies the same logic to all handguns. In reality, it imposes an eventual ban on all private, lawful ownership of handguns. Current owners will be grandfathered, but under this legislation, handguns could no longer be acquired by or sold to individuals or inherited by a licensed heir. But what problem is this legislation meant to solve? The data is unequivocal. Well over 90% of firearms seized in the commission of a crime or that are possessed unlawfully in Canada have been smuggled by organized crime from the United States. That should come as no surprise, since Canada adjoins the largest and most permissive gun market in the world. Almost anyone can acquire an array of handguns at a US gun show. This Liberal government came to power claiming it would engage in evidence-based decision-making. Instead, this bill amounts to decision-based evidence-seeking. Show me the data that supports this bill. There is none. Instead of being honest with Canadians and devising constructive policies that will actually curb the northbound torrent of crime guns from the United States, this bill constructs a false narrative against 4 million lawful, licensed, and background-checked firearms owners. With the exception of sensible new powers in the case of intimate partner violence or CBSA, this bill will do just about nothing to curb the rampant gun crime in Canada. However, it does ensure that only criminals will possess handguns. This is hardly reassuring for a government that has made it largely impossible to hold criminals on bail, even after multiple breaches of conditions, free once again to re-victimize law-abiding citizens. This legislation is a cynical ploy to polarize Canadian society by leveraging firearms as a wedge issue ahead of the next federal election. But that is par for the course for this government, with its robust track record of putting boutique electoral priorities ahead of the national interest. In over 20 years of studying public safety and national security across democratic countries, I have never seen a bill with this great a disconnect between its supposed means and ends. Any parliamentarian who votes in favor of this bill is going on record as disdaining evidence, supporting derision, fanning polarization, encouraging disinformation, and wasting scarce public resources on policy measures that miss their intended target. This bill does next to nothing to make the Canadian public any safer. It will neither solve nor prevent a single crime. Je vous remercie.
Thank you.
Correct. And finally, our last witness today is Dr. Caillin Langmann. You may proceed when you are ready, Dr. Langmann.
Thank you for letting me present my research regarding Canadian firearms legislation and its association with homicide, spousal homicide, mass homicide, and suicide in Canada. I'm an assistant professor of medicine and emergency physician as well. I serve as an academic peer reviewer in the areas of firearms control and have 4 peer-reviewed publications on legislation and the effects of homicide and suicide in Canada. The relevance of my research regarding C21. I demonstrated previous bans in the 1990s of a large number of semi-automatic rifles and handguns had no effect on homicide or suicide rates. Since 2003, the number of owned restricted firearms has doubled from 572,000 to 1.2 million. However, the rate of overall firearm homicide has not increased, nor has the rate of homicide by handguns. In the 1990s, legislation prohibited over 550,000 firearms, including military-style firearms and handguns. However, research has demonstrated that there was no statistically significant benefit on homicide, spousal homicide, or mass homicide rates. Restrictions on magazine capacity in 1994 was not associated with decreases in homicide or mass homicide rates, as well as red flag laws in the 1990s also had no associated benefit in terms of spousal homicide rates. Other jurisdictions, such as Australia and England, have also applied significant controls to handguns and semi-automatic rifles, with no statistically significant changes in homicide rates. Studies from the United States examining assault weapon bans also reveal no significant benefit. Blau et al. 2016 and Siegel 2020 found that these legislations were not associated with a decrease in victims. Interesting, when looking at 30 years of incidents, Blau found that shotguns were more associated with an increase in victims than semi-automatic rifles. Webster et al. In 2020 used a similar quasi-experimental methodology as myself, and did not find an association between assault weapon bans and mass homicide incidents or deaths. In summary, the evidence so far demonstrates that the proposed handgun and semi-automatic rifle bans will have no associated reduction in homicide rates or mass homicide rates. Methods that have been shown to be more effective in reducing firearms homicides involve targeting the demand side of firearms prevalence in criminal activity. As demonstrated by StatsCan, a significant percentage of firearms homicide involves gang violence, up to 50% that we know of. The evidence suggests that you need to act early to reduce youth involvement in gangs. A research report by Public Safety Canada in 2012 gathered evidence from programs operating in Canada to reduce youth gang participation and demonstrated beneficial effects in the ranges of 50% reduction in participation in gangs. The likely billions of dollars spent to confiscate firearms from legal firearms owners would probably be better spent on youth diversion and gang reduction programs, as well as programs in terms of suicide reduction and women's programs for leaving at homes at risk. Thank you for your time. Mr. Chair, I'd also like to add that I'm not speaking as the Director of Emergency Medicine Program at McMaster here. I don't know how that got on the Senate information, but I'm speaking as an Assistant Clinical Professor of Medicine at McMaster.
Thanks very much for that clarification, Dr. Langmann, and thank you for your statement today. Colleagues, we'll now proceed to questions. We have to finish at 1:30 p.m., and as with the last panel, we will limit each question, including the answer, to 4 minutes. Please keep questions succinct and identify the person you're addressing the question to. I offer the first question to our Deputy Chair, Senator Dagenet, and I have Senators Boisvenu, Deakin, Ontario, O and Kuchar on the list currently. Over to you, Senator Dagenet.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question is for Mr. Langmann. Mr. Langmann, when we are talking about firearms control, Canadian politicians generally legislate towards popular requests after things that are covered by the media, like the Polytechnic issue, killings in Quebec, or the Nova Scotia killings. In your research, you've talked about the reduction in firearms homicides over the past 50 years, which are not attributed to firearms. In your opinion, is it because the laws are poorly targeted, or would you say that irrespective of the laws that are adopted by the government, it's impossible to absolutely prevent such crimes?
I'd say it's probably multifactorial. Number one, there's a high amount of substitution in terms of firearms acquisition. So as my colleague mentioned, a lot of firearms are obtained from the United States or from legal sources. And more we're seeing them produced at home or in many factories illegally. In terms of background checks and screening, there may be some work there in terms of making it more rigorous, and that is ensuring that it's actually being done. It may be that some people are slipping through because their background references are not checked. There's no way of performing studies in that regard, as that kind of data is unavailable. So that may be an area of focus, though it's probable that there will be no benefit in regards to that, as people can simply choose a reference or lie on their application if they need to. It's very difficult to predict who is going to commit an illegal act. You can use some background behavior as a prediction, but I do psychiatry all the time, and even predicting this is extremely difficult. There are no models to use. There's no clinical decision tools to use that will accurately predict this. The best we can probably use is the already existing prohibitions on ownership, and the question is whether those are actually followed up by the people placing the restrictions. So our probation officers following up on these prohibitions, it's going to be very difficult to follow that up, of course. But that's probably where you could get most of your benefit. The other place you could probably get most of your benefit is by reducing the number of youths that are getting involved in gangs early before they get deeply involved, and you're unable to get them out of that situation, and they're causing these types of crimes. And there's some good studies on that as well.
Sorry to interrupt. We have to move on. Yes, Senator Boisvenu, followed by Senator Deacon, Ontario. Senator Boisvenu.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Alors,
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question goes to Mr. Leuprecht. You have made a very direct assertion at the beginning of your presentation, saying that this bill veils the real intention of government to go towards a total abolition of firearms in Canada. Could you please explain your reasoning that I share, I must say?
La logique.
The logic is looking at what has happened over time. If you look at amendments to Section 12 that was implemented in 2005, which led to the elimination of some firearms, and there's the expansion of this approach and logic, which over time seeks to eliminate firearms possession, because even if you were to inherit a firearm, you do not have the right to inherit the firearm. So over time, if this bill is adopted, firearms will be eliminated. Mr. Langmann, you said that all the measures that have been taken in Canada over 30 years have had no impact in reducing homicides. I said a while ago that homicides were strongly reduced without the register than with the register. Now we're going to spend $1 billion in addition to the $2 billion already spent in 2015, which had no impact. This additional $1 billion that will be spent, do you think this will be the main consequence of concentrating firearms in the hands of criminals in Canada?
Sure about the translation, but the $1 billion spent will not go towards reducing any homicides or suicides in this country that will be measurable. And it's not just my research that demonstrates that, it's research from Australia as well. Australia went through this actual process where they banned a significant type of number of firearms, or 600,000 semi-automatic and pistols. And they saw in all the studies have shown no benefit in terms of reductions in terms of suicide and homicide, so overall suicide rates and homicide. So I think that $1 billion would be better spent on programs that will have a benefit. I mentioned one of those, which is targeting youth at risk. May also benefit in terms of getting help for people with suicidal ideation. This is something that I see every day as an emergency physician. I see people coming in with suicidal ideation from issues they have in terms of depression, and it's extremely difficult to get them help. We look at wait times of over 6 months for some people. We have a shortage of physicians that are working in this area. I would strongly suggest that the government does a redirect and looks at those areas instead of confiscating firearms from people who are generally safe in the first place. They're screened already, have a very low risk of criminal behavior.
Thank you, Senator Dagenet. Senator Deacon, Ontario, over to you.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. I wasn't sure if I'd missed the order there. Thank you very much. And thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. Two very important perspectives. I'm coming back and thinking about that joint letter that was referred to earlier this afternoon, and in that letter, the signed, you expressed concerns around variance and suggested that we consider enshrining a definition in law using the definition proposed by Bill C-230, that a variant in respect of a firearm means that a firearm that has an unmodified frame or receiver of another firearm. I had a look at this bill and the debates in the House where it was defeated in an earlier parliament. Some of the concerns around defining a variant through legislation were that it could actually end up resulting in reclassifying thousands of firearms, and that many firearms would move unnecessarily from their present classification to a more controlled class. In other cases, it could put more dangerous guns on the market. So I'm wondering why, in fact, through this letter, you do not share these concerns.
Who are you addressing your question to?
Both of you, if you'd like to go ahead first, sir, that would be great.
So, in terms of firearm variants, this is an extremely difficult area to determine, classify a firearm. So, you have three types of firearms. You have basically an automatic firearm, a semi-automatic firearm, which reloads itself after a single pull of the trigger, and then you have sort of manual action firearms like a bolt action rifle. Bolt action rifles are very prevalent in this country and are probably the most powerful firearm available. They are not being looked at being restricted at this point. As an emergency physician, they're important to me because they fire a projectile that is traveling at a very high speed and often does more damage than a projectile fired from a handgun or even most semi-automatic rifles, which tend to use smaller calibers. So for me, it's rather irrelevant, really. All firearms are dangerous. I don't see one particular type of firearm any more dangerous than another. As I spoke to you already, other studies like Blau et al. Showed that shotguns are associated with a higher rate of victims in terms of mass shootings than other types of firearms, as can handguns be. I think that it's an area of semantics and it's relatively an area of irrelevance. You're talking about technical details, whether someone with any skills could modify these firearms and change it to one category to another. We have seen firearms that have absolutely no mechanisms that function as fully automatic, being classified as fully automatic. We have firearms that have no mechanisms that function the same as AR-15s that are being classified the same as AR-15s. So you're arguing over tiny little details when the really important stuff is going unnoticed.
Thank you. We have to move on, I'm afraid. We now go to Senator O.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, witnesses. My question is for Professor Christine Leuprecht. You mentioned about, you have a powerful statement, and, for licensed people who owns a gun under the house and, equip nothing on the handgun. I just wondering what happened, if this bill is passed. So what happened to the value of the guns, and how can you get rid of it? Can you still sell it to someone, or can you sell it overseas? Or, who is going to pay the loss of all this value and property of the, can you tell us that?
Well, in effect, it'll have the same effect as 12.6 had, which is will vastly diminish the value of any of these firearms because the transactions, the transactions will effectively be prohibited. And so you've essentially reduced the market for these firearms. And there's many collector, for instance, handguns that would be captured under this that, for instance, have significant value. So that's sort of one consideration, certainly, to keep in mind.
So can they turn to government and say, you buy all my properties, all my collections?
Well, I suppose government could try to put a value on this, but like as with many things that people collect, they collect them not for primarily for the value that this collection that it has, but because people collect things for sentimental and a whole host of other reasons. So you're essentially telling people that because you like particular types of firearms, many of which are never actually even fired because they're too old and precious, but you have to give them up and you can't collect these anymore because we don't value what you cherish in terms of collecting. Do we do this in other areas where people collect mementos?
Yeah. Do you believe that the government should put more funds and money into young gang violence, to take care of, more better laws and more enforcement on the gang violence?
So it turns out, Senator, today my new book with the University of Michigan Press on the Canada-U.S. border is being published, Security, Cooperation, Governance. And certainly there are many opportunities here for us to work closely, very closely with our colleagues in the United States. In many cases, ATF is our closest partner in identifying key sourcing of firearms into Canada. And yes, reducing culture. A lot of guns is around culture. This is what the legislation is essentially about. The legislation says that we don't want any sort of a culture associated with guns in Canada. And so in the same way, we can put money into reducing the gun culture that in certain sub-communities within Canada, where simply owning a gun, or what's known as packing, is simply part of the culture.
I have also seen CBC documentary that people walking over the Quebec border between US and Canada, and we bag full of handguns. And do you think we should tighten up more on the border crossing?
Well, look, given the length of the border, I think any enforcement at the border is not going to be particularly useful. We ultimately need intelligence. We need to reduce the demand side within this country, in particular in communities that are at high risk, such as that communities that gravitate towards gangs. I don't think putting more money at enforcement at the actual border, but I think the significant opportunities exist for intelligence cooperation, in particular with our partners in the United States, that are not actively being harnessed.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Leuprecht. We go to Senator Kuchar next, followed by Senators Gerber, Youssef, and Cardozo. Senator Kuchar.
Thank you very much. This question is to Dr. Langmann, and I apologize that it's quite long and complicated, and so I'm going to read it because it's about precision in research. As you are aware, a recent Ontario study has showed that 2/3 of firearm-related deaths are from suicide, and that 70% of all gun-related deaths in Canada are suicides. And this is clearly not from criminal activity. 2016 to 2020, about 2,700 men in Canada died from firearm suicide. A prospective U.S. study of 26 million people showed that males who owned handguns were 8 times more likely to die by suicide, females 35 times more likely. Public health axiom is having access to lethal means as the primary cause for death by suicide. A Harvard University School of Public Health, in their summary of evidence, disagrees with your testimony. Quote, states with more key firearm laws had fewer firearm homicides, fewer firearm suicides, after controlling for poverty, unemployment, education, race, and non-firearm violence-related death, end quote. That's like hanging. They also noted, quote, some gun policy evaluations are designed to ensure that no effect will be found, end quote. They also noted, quote, the results of a flawed study should not affect policy, end quote. The Rand Institute report, What Science Tells Us About the Effects of Gun Policies of January 2023, noted that different types of legislation had different types of effects. They quote, the absence of evidence about a law can result from the law not having been studied or not being studied well. They noted that poor methodology results in erroneous conclusions. In your brief, you stated that your conclusions were, quote, based on sound statistical analysis and information, end quote. I read your PLS 01 paper, Effective Firearms Legislation on Suicide and Homicide, which your testimony is based on. And Because I didn't want to review it myself for the committee, I asked experts to review it for me. And this is what they said, in part, that there were numerous problems with the methodology. And I'll just quote some of them. The application of the statistical difference in difference methodology is improperly applied. Another, that the parallel trends assumption that you use is not met in the data set. Another, that the stable unit treatment value assumption is also violated. They do point out, and senators will see this because I'll be circulating all this information to senators. In Figure 1 in your paper, you show a clear decrease in suicide by firearms for both males and females from 1980 to 2016. Also in your paper in Figure 2, you show a clear decrease in homicide by firearm for both females and males. They say, quote, the conclusion that increased firearm legislation does not decrease suicide nor homicide is not supported by the evidence presented by the author, end quote. And then they say, quote, the trends don't lie, but the author engaged in complex analyses and questionable assumptions to build a model to arrive at his desired conclusion, end quote. I wonder if you could respond to these concerns.
So it's not just me that has shown that so there's two different things, all right? Number one is that there's no effect on homicide rates in terms of the legislation that's been passed. I invite you to come and talk to me either by phone or by email and discuss these issues. You're presenting something with that I can't really respond to because I haven't seen it. However, it's not just me that shows that the legislation has had no beneficial effect. I submitted a brief looking at other Canadian studies which also show the same thing as I did. When you use the highest quality methodology, and my studies have been included in a Canadian Medical Association journal analysis and was rated as the highest quality studies, right? Above all the other studies that have been done on this country. When you look at those studies, there is no association using time series analysis in terms of homicide reduction and firearms legislation. Now,
Langmann,
why do we use time series?
I'm sorry to interrupt.
So
I've given you an extra piece of time to respond, but if you want to come back to this later, we can. But I'm
Mr.
afraid
Chair,
we have to move on. I'm sorry.
Mr. Chair, basically, I've just been slurred and I can't respond.
Well, you may have an opportunity to do that with subsequent questions, but we have to move on. Senator Gerber, you are next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question goes to Mr. Leuprecht. You mentioned in your opening remarks that most firearms seized came from the United States, about 90% of them. Hence, Bill C21 will be missing its target by focusing on the Canadian situation and not on the situation from our southern neighbors. In your opinion, what measures should be taken to resolve this issue? Do you have any solutions to propose? That's my first question. In other words, how can Bill C21 be improved to resolve this issue?
Madame, je vous remercie de...
Thank you, Senator, for your intervention and for your question, a very important one. If we all try to reduce the harm that is done by firearms, including the previous question, well, to fix the problem caused by firearms now, we can't do that with a bill. The situation that leads to the situation, the fact that we are neighbors with the United States, individual dynamics are not issues that can be resolved with legislation, but we could resolve them using public policies and proper investments that we have available to us. So I will talk of more effective collaboration, particularly with the federal police, with the intelligence services, the federal intelligence services, which have better capacities when it comes to firearms. They would do a lot more to limit the serious movement of firearms and people, something that I've clearly documented in our research, in articles that I've published. This would create a greater impact than targeting individuals who own firearms in a legal way. I'm afraid that this bill will once again divide to better reign and compromise the credibility of democratic institutions amongst a group that already has a lot of concerns when it comes to the federal government. So I'm afraid that this bill will rather be instrumentalized to undermine not only the credibility of the federal government, but that of institutions, including intelligence services and the forces of law and order, including the police. So if we look at our experience with the RCMP for firearms, I think we should invest in RCMP reforms, and that will give us more results than this bill.
For that response, we now go to Senator Youssef, to be followed by Senator Cardoso, and on round two I have Senators Dagenet and Boisvenu, which should just about take us to the end of our remaining time. Senator Youssef.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for being here. My question is to Dr. Langmann. I'm not sure if any of your research and data might shed light on the question I'm about to ask, but I want to ask about whether your research says anything about stolen legal handguns. I read statistics that almost 9,000 handguns were stolen between 2001 and 2006, most which was never recovered. Does your research have any indication where these guns might have ended up in Canadian society?
That's an extremely difficult question since we don't really have all that data. A lot of those firearms are missing. The question is, does the legislation that has been presented in the past is similar to the legislation going forward? Has that reduced firearms homicide in any way, or spousal homicide, or even mass homicide? And the answer is no. So the restrictions on the ownership of semi-automatic firearms, many of them were banned in the 1990s. Restriction on the ownership of certain handguns, many banned in the 1990s. That had no beneficial association in terms of firearm homicide. So the current legislation, which is proposing the same sort of ban, I don't see how that's going to have an effect going forward.
Well, my question wasn't about homicide. Just want to know if you had any data regarding where these stolen handguns might have ended up. Maybe one quick follow-up, Mr. Langmann, if you may. In regard to C21, is there any provisions in the bill that you see as worthy of public policy in regard to its objective?
I think perhaps only the legislation about so-called ghost guns. I don't think that there's any anything in this legislation that's going to have any benefit. The red flag laws, which I use myself occasionally, I do practice. Out of all the people here that you've had present, I'm probably one of the only people that actually uses this legislation as an emergency physician. I see this all the time. Currently, the legislation is easy to use. There may be benefit in terms of inserting into the legislation some protection for physicians or nurses or healthcare workers that report a patient. However, the red flag laws, both in my studies, show no benefit. Studied by Dr. Winterview in California, and their red flag laws have shown no benefit as well. I think that's about it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Cardoso.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first, I just want to add to my colleagues the condolences to the family of Senator Shugart. In addition to being a colleague in the Senate, he served Canada with distinction as a senior public servant, which is where I first met him and worked with him at HRSDC. Clearly, we've lost a stellar public servant today. My question is for either of our witnesses, and I hear your strong objection to the bill. And this is partly, I guess, in follow-up to my colleague, Senator Youssef's question. Is there any parts of it that you feel are useful, especially in regards to intimate partner violence, which is a problem that it continues to grow, even though we have become so much more aware of it and are willing to talk about it in recent years and decades, but we don't seem to be able to deal with, to really get a handle on it or reduce it substantially. Are there any parts of this you feel assist in that area?
Why don't we have some brief reactions, and we'll start with Mr. Leuprecht.
Who are you addressing this to?
To both of you. So,
yes. So if we start with Mr. Leuprecht
first.
Senator Cardoso, and a very important topic. But I have yet to see, and of course I'm not very aware of all the submissions that might have been made, a police service in this country that is asking for this legislation in order to reduce intimate partner violence. Intimate partner violence is a serious problem. But when it comes to firearm, as the previous panel already went through, the instruments at the disposal of law enforcement are already plentiful and seem to be working just fine. So, I would say that if we want to reduce intimate partner violence, maybe we should be looking at the loosening of bail restrictions and people who are coming to reoffend on previous victims, and that might have a much greater impact than having these superficial conversations about sort of how we could tweak the mechanics of firearms legislation and in the process demonizing 4 million law-abiding Canadians.
I don't think you meant to say that the current situation works just fine.
Just
yes, Dr. Langmann, please go ahead.
Just to answer that question, I mean, the issue is, firearms are used in less than 1% of intimate partner violence. The partner who's at risk, they face the biggest danger at the time when they're about to leave. And in terms of what I see on the ground, we have a very low and limited supply of women's shelters and places for people to go. The second issue is, as my colleague mentioned, what is being done about people who have weapons prohibitions? It's very easy for the police to confiscate these firearms. I see it happen. I've called in myself to the CFO. But what is actually being done to ensure that someone is not going out and acquiring weapons or stalking that person? So you might want to look at actual on-the-ground approach to what you can do rather than these high-minded legislations that mostly are going to affect people that have already been background screened. I mean, you're talking about a population in Canada that has been background screened, that has a very low risk of violence, and you're trying to squeak out a little benefit in that group, and you're not focusing on the group that is causing the problem. They're already prohibited from owning firearms. They're already prohibited from a firearms license. Yes, every now and then there is a rare event that happens where a firearm owner does commit a crime, but it's extremely difficult to predict, and it is extremely rare.
Okay, thank you very much. We have two senators to round out the session. We've got 3 minutes each for questions and answers. Senator Dagenet first, followed by Senator Boisvenu.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question for Mr. Leuprecht. Mr. Leuprecht, could you give us your opinion, positive or negative, on C21? Do we really need a legislation or investment in police services to fight against illegal firearms? Because I think C21 will have no dissuasive impact on organized crime.
Monsieur Miger.
Thank you, Mr. Dagenet. Just to clarify, with Senator Cardoso, what I wanted to say is that instruments at the disposal of the police seem to be working, but the consequences that my colleague mentioned, we have many areas where the government could invest to keep people safer. Mr. Dagenet, now when it comes to Bill C21, I think that particularly in Ontario and Quebec, the RCMP is not very present when it comes to firearms control. The borders are very easy to cross, and the Ontario police and the Quebec police are those working in this area. So the RCMP is absent. So we have people living around major American cities where it's easy to have access to firearms. So we will need the RCMP to be more involved to coordinate things like intelligence, because the provincial police can only work with the police force in America, but cannot collaborate with federal partners. So we need greater commitment from the RCMP. And we need to target the two provinces, Ontario and Quebec, and the major cities. This would provide better results than the discussion we are currently having on C21. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Senator Dagenet.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is also for Mr. Leuprecht. Yesterday, the Public Safety Minister of Quebec, Mr. Bonadel, announced an investment of $28 million in Quebec prisons to end the drone issue. The minister identified the Bordeaux prison and compared it to the Montreal airport. That says it all. At a time when Canadian prison superintendents are asking for more reliable and effective tools to prevent the entry of illegal weapons into prisons, and the government is going to spend $1 billion, don't you think that the government is not probably targeting its priorities? We find ourselves in a very difficult fiscal situation for the current government, so we should be careful in the way we use public resources. It would appear that the $1 billion investment could be spent in a more effective way to obtain more economic benefits than simply buying firearms from owners in Canada. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Dasco, there is time for one last question, and you have it.
Thank you, Chair. I am following up briefly on the comments in response to Senator Cardozo's question about domestic violence, and the comment that was made about police not requesting the provisions under the red flag laws in C21. Now, I just wanted to ask both witnesses, certainly you are, or should be, or might be aware of many cases that we hear about where police disregard warnings and allow individuals to keep their guns despite clear risk factors that are known to police, including cases where the perpetrator might be subject to a restraining order. And I would suggest that this is why gun control advocates want less discretion on the part of police and are looking for measures, the type of measures that we see in 21. So I would appreciate comments from either of the witnesses about that. Thank you.
Senator Daska, as a member of our Police Services Board, let me say that this government has already downloaded significant costs in terms of public safety onto local communities. You can look at the police budget in Kingston just to have us to keep doing what the Kingston Police Service is doing. What this legislation will do is impose further requirements that effectively are being paid for by local communities with relatively little effect. And the reason why our police forces cannot achieve the objectives that you have laid out is because our police services are already overstretched and overtasked and underfunded for what we are expecting them to do. So if the government is prepared to also provide a cost equalization to the provinces to ensure that the costs on justice decisions such as this bill are being properly capitalized by provinces so that local municipalities can recover these costs from the federal government, then I'm happy for you, Senator, to support any law that you choose, provided my community doesn't have to pay for it out of our local tax dollars.
So you don't disagree with the premise of my question then? Correct?
We live in a democracy, and,
no, in
and you have the right to decide.
In fact, that there are many cases where police disregard the warnings and do not take action. I would understand that you are agreeing with the premise and you're pointing to perhaps a reason why they don't, but you do agree then with what I'm suggesting.
Why don't we ask the Canadian Chiefs of Police whether they would agree with the assertion that you are making, and whether they believe that the proposition that you have put forward is an effective measure to deal with the particular challenges faced around these particular circumstances. But I would submit that that this is perhaps not the appropriate instrument, and yet to impose yet further expectations on police and to demonize police for not applying legislation that they have. Senator Dasco, all the police officers that I know do their absolute best every day under the most difficult circumstances, and this government has made it more difficult for them to do their job. So to say that police are not doing their job is not acceptable, Senator Dasco.
Demonizing police, thank you.
We will leave it at that. Colleagues, this brings us to the end of our panel. I'd like to extend our sincere thanks to Mr. Leuprecht and Dr. Langmann. We greatly appreciate your contributions here today, and this is an important issue, and you've helped us considerably as we move forward. So thank you for that, and we wish you both well. And we